Okay, pleased to see you again. You are now in second session about this topic. What do you consider the factors to influence what the administrative agencies in creating public policy and implementing law and rules and so. We think about general influences in as a thread. You can see the many factors to impact the cause and standard that the administrations is deliberate. For example, there are some point to come into play in terms of structure and authority, as we consider in last class. And also, you see the practical aspect about the dynamism of bureaucracy. In understanding modern bureaucratic practice, the name is important. You see Max Weber and his one important theorist to bridge the public sphere into capitalist paradigm of a economy, and we generally consider a private sector. So one article is very important, interesting. I once came across whose name is. What is his name? I'm not exactly sure. Glastick and one of European scholar, which points his focus at some miscarriage in the interpretive process of a Weber's proposition. So we consider most important theme and value embedded in modern bureaucracy would be efficacy. Efficacy is a central ideal that the bureaucrats and administrative agencies would purport to realize, and efficiency, a kind of concept would come in rather as shared. However, his argument would be interesting that the misunderstanding in the process of interpretation would place the Weber's perspective in that aspect. However, Weber never would make any strong endeavor on that strand, efficacy or efficiency. Rather, his point in emphasis would be a certainty reduction. So the contribution of bureaucracies and modern administrative government would not be so idealistic, actually. However, it could work, and to serve a uncertain area of a society or basic paradigm could be diminished with ethical and moral force of a bureaucracy. How do you perceive it? So I recommend some of supplementary studies about his viewpoint later. Encouraged to make time to experience his soul. The sociological perspective unraveled over many works and contributions of scholars would also conform the pattern or attitude in terms of operation and organizational culture, for example. Have you ever known the word a bureaucratic maze? So now the contemporary government would rely on some of intoxicated myriad of a network and complexities of bureaucrats, unions, branches. So it could well be hallucinated as deviated from original embrace of a bureaucracies and others. So it is actually settled in any way of a social system and environable new mode of a subsistence. The term would very stimulative to understand the nature and quality of our peers and neighbors. How do you place their role and responsibilities in modern administrative state? And the institutions and administrative agencies are important. For example, to follow up with the science or technology development, for example, and the kind of a decency and procedure to be respected in terms of a human community and value, so could be entwined with the concept of a rule of laws. So the dimension to be present in practice and any realistic context of a function could well be seen as general influences, for example. And there are, of course, many factors to be considered. Interestingly, we see two camps, which insects the essence of a contemporary bureaucratic practice. One would be a bureau dominant school, which perceives the role of bureaucrats and administrative agencies would amount to any paramount as any paramount context. So this viewpoint would rather practical and realistic. If we now faced with the kind of a limited environment from political branches and constitutional a judiciary and the other school of thought would be a principal agency framework. So the bureaucracy would be expected to be loyal and keep faith with the principle, ultimately to the popular will and kind of national or state sovereignty, for example, and also we consider the interplay of constitutional branches of government with the administrative agencies. They would, for example, need to be responsible to the elected officials, congressional members, or collectively to Congress, and, for example, President. And also, the judiciary would come into a precious role to ensure the values, constitutional values, and other structural concern between private and public terms. So it could be seen as important institution to ensure, for example, the value of a life. What is due process concept, as we served in the previous class? Nobody would be deprived of his life or liberty, property right without due process of law. That constitutional command could be safeguarded by a judicial branch. So it could be a principle in concept and in the frame of interaction. So the administrative agencies would be placed in that context to uphold their intent and command. So one perspective would rather be structural and would conform to the general understanding, typically bear some implications in contemplating accountability of administrative agencies. So they are responsible to Congress, for example, and we considered a legislative veto one example for the Congress to initiate their control. Practically, the Congress would utilize many tools to assure the compliance of administrative agencies with their direction and the expression of a constitutional authority in terms of a statutory laws. What could we conceive to ensure accountability initiated by Congress? Notably, we think about money. Money is a useful tool to promote the engagement of administrative action and encourage the active measure, for example. In other cases, the appropriations could work most effectively. And we consider two dimensions in terms of this concern, accountability. So initially, the Congress may put some condition or terms about, with a public program. So they could spell out the nature of a public programs and delineate the kind of proper ways to respond. So principal command could be prescribed to lead the state administrative agencies, and also as learned the intelligent principle to be shaped in response with non-delegation doctrine. And they could also utilize the appropriations process, which is very received very seriously by the administrative agencies in normal conditions. So actually, without the appropriations bills, the public programs or act could not be enforced. So it is fatal if they fail to achieve the appropriations as planned. So the context could also be compared with Korean situations. Often the end of the year would be denigrated by some unfortunate scenes, for example, physical confrontation or altercation in some cases in fierce manner. You see, we see the kind of misfortune to be destined for the Korean Assembly. The context could be reduced in previous year. Last year, typically, we see some decent ending of congressional session. So the local broadcasting would introduce some important figure in terms of Korean politics about the partisan politics to obtain appropriations. So actually many local projects and public programs which are beneficial to the local people would be serious. And it's practically most important matter in concern that the politicians and local politicians will moderate their tone and attitudes in National Assembly. So that is one tactic to obtain a maximum possible extent of appropriations. So I have left. That plainly shows how much the appropriations would impact the public programs and the capabilities of administrative agencies to respond with the errand and challenges, and also how much was to be related with the local interest. And the United States Congress also rely on typical pattern of a mechanism, oversight mechanism, such as a corrections day, for example, and deadlines or hammers. What is deadline? It is the time limit on day. The public agency should decide or act in complete fashion about specific statutory requirement or mandate. So upon passage of that deadline, the delegation or authorization could be terminated. What is hammering concept? Hammer is quite opposite. That upon passage of time, the the context could come in inverse. So there would be no, of course, definite engagement. The Congress could hope in the attachment of public programs or others. In that case, the kind of tools could operate very effectively. So they, in response to public pressure, may have no way to go with a public program attached. However, the strict terms of deadline or hammers could make them avoid the kind of a realistic cost. For example, it may require a cost to change for the industry, who would be constituent and some source to fund a political campaign or others. So they would be reluctant to attach the public program, interestingly. However, could not resist without the public program, since the opinion leaders or interest groups would fairly serious to forge this the public program in public interest. So imagine the kind of strong stance of an environmentalist. However, the bureaucrats could be incompetent or practically impossible in some rare cases to respect the deadline or the operation of hammers set forth by the Constitution. That could actually fail the program entirely, which would be in some sense, in some context, could be the wishes of congressmen. So that would, of course, not be the case all the way through. We may be occasional of the kind of a and interesting is that the accountability could also be varied according to the shift of administration. For example, the oversight program, what is practiced by each administration over United States history, has some bearing with the partisan politics. For example, we could ascertain the kind of strong tendency of oversight program being deepened and broadened by George Bush, for example, and Ronald Reagan. So the Republican form of government would tend to tighten the oversight program, which would go otherwise in other administration. For example, Clinton, or how do you assess the attitude of the Obama administration? And what is a correction day? That could come in some of prior context of a statutory review control of a administrative rules and others. That would be cherished in response with a stern control of judiciary. What you see in Chada case, for example, as a lesser veto could not survive if the statute could fail to meet the condition terms announced by the court. In Small Business Promotion Act, the legislature would utilize the kind of a correction day, which is a system to oversee the failure or denigration of a administrative agencies as deviated from the intent of Congress, what is. So that could be one technical way without any violation of Constitution or legal theories, but to reserve the power to oversee the action of administrative agencies. In that case, the crucial concept would revolve with a major. What is major? So often the administrative disputes could be approached in interwoven context with a statute term. How do we connote that term? And rest of history could be investigated, for example, and others. So the term major is most important and would be delegated to the administrative agencies about its determination. The Congress would be skeptic, perhaps, about the standard and a principle they wish to be respected. So the Congress could set a correction day whether the action or decision of administration is acceptable as accorded with the original intent. So in the lower level, the congressman would act likely as a founding fathers. So the draftsman of a congressman should be actually prudent and scrupulous to set a proper guidelines beforehand, which is priori actually, and also ensure a good feedback about political accountability of administrative agencies. So the Bureau Dominance School, information politics or management must structure channel, or otherwise affect the behavior of bureaucrats if it is to influence rulemaking. Who or what controls bureaucracy is one of central questions in contemporary scholarship devoted to public affairs. In this concern, there are pronounced differences between those who have concluded bureaucracy is the dominant force in the public policy process, and others who view bureaucrats as the servants of external masters. The Bureau dominant school has included scholars as disparate as the political scientist Theodore Louis and economist William Niskanen. As evidence of Bureau autonomy, they pointed to massive delegations of authority, the near monopoly the bureaus enjoy with regard to critical information. So you consider the context could be reinforced, as you see, massive delegations, for example, and competent resources to deal with what others. Information, science-based deals with public matters, and time and institutional resources would often be found in administrative branches. In other constitutional branches of government, resources, power, or incentives to monitor and control agencies could be present. So the role of Congress would be gone with the power to monitor and control agencies. They would rather be disfavored if we see in the realist context of implementation and others. Lowy has referred to the bureaucrats who write rules as patrons, who dole out benefits to the American people, who have been reduced to serfs. Niskanen focused on the behavior of bureaucrats in attempting to obtain budgets and argued that congressional committees that review such requests will frequently accede to the budget maximizing proposals. According to the Bureau dominance perspective, if law, information, and politics play a role in rulemaking, it is largely to the extent that bureaucrats allow. So the perspective would go in opposite way. So bureaucrats would determine practically the measure of a public intervention. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Bureau dominant school of thought is correct and that the agencies are largely free to fashion rules to their liking. What implications does this hold for the content of rules? Existing scholarship on the composition and behavior of bureaucracies indicates that the results of rulemaking are influenced by personal, professional, structural factors. The personal level has already been seen through those admittedly stylized bureaucratic types. So many works on the personal level, and just as each type may adopt a different posture to a rulemaking per se, each seeks to achieve different results in rulemaking. The goal of conservators is likely to be a rule that represents the least threat to the comfortable status quo, or alternatively, the least potential disruption to their careers. So the attitude and styles of bureaucrats are actually important factor to be researched in any more systemic way. So one scholar is very excites us, for example, who is a climber. So a kind of typical person to seek his prestige, also some opportunity, higher chance opportunities to promote in the workplace. So actually that could be gone in that way. How do you consider? And how much are you skeptic about oversight of administrative agencies? And also, you will have another concept, for example, GLUT. What typicals could be found in the kind of person, the kind of office? So they, in this scope, would be very enthusiastic with the public commitment and some organizational ends and others. So may be seen useful in on one hand, however, may fail the grand picture of a collaboration, coordination. In some cases, increase the conflict, the unnecessary conflict with other branches or units. So climbers actively pursue any rule-making result that might advance their careers. This may mean acting to establish themselves as experts in a new area of law and public policy, thus enhancing career options in the private sector, or simply currying favor with the superior in the agency, capable of recommending or granting promotion, a salary increase, or a bonus. The bureaucracies actually write rules are populated with people with different motivations and personal goals. As Don denotes, pure forms of these types are probably not as common as what he calls mixed motive bureaucrats, who vacillate between behaviors of the various types, depending on the circumstances surrounding the rule and the stage of their careers. What is clear, however, is that when these motivations and behaviors manifest themselves in rulemaking agencies, the results of rulemaking are affected. William West has identified the professional differences among bureaucrats that affect the content of rules, focusing on the importance of training and viewpoint. He properly conceives of rulemaking as a bureaucratic task that routinely requires the involvement of lawyers, scientific and technical experts, policy analysts, and senior agency officials serving as political appointees. He hypothesizes that each of these professional groups brings different perspectives and objectives to the rulemaking enterprise. These arise from the education, training, and allegiance. Attorneys seek rules that are true to the statutes they implement, that are enforceable and capable of surviving a judicial review. Scientific and technical personnel seek rules that reflect the state of knowledge in their respective disciplines, whereas policy analysts, at least those trained in cost-benefit analysis, want rules that maximize net benefits through a survey of agency personnel. West confirmed that the hypothesized differences can be observed in the response of the professional groups to questions about various aspects of rulemaking. So we consider resources, and actually in the context we see some normative frames about substantial evidence. So now the administrative agencies often be pushed forward by the constitutions and the elected officers who actually enact the statute and laws to command and orders. So they may be challenged by, for example, industries in normal circumstances, which actually highly depends on the decision or discretion of the administrative of agencies. So in some cases, they criticize the administrative action since they fail to exercise a cost-benefit analysis. So actually, that could be raised in some concern, as we see in other cases. The Congress could not be definite or specific to respond with every details of situation or requirement. So could be abstract and general in dealings. So what is a technically and economically feasible, which is term to be employed by Congress. What does it mean? So how do you see the necessary and proper response with the command of a public health, for example? The context is very delicate and could be could fall in failure. For example, if we strictly bound of any mathematical straitjacket. Yes, kind of. You see in the context that the terms could be dealt in leniencies, and scope of leeways could be possible, which would absolutely not require a mathematical straitjacket. So the court could deny the kind of contention to counter-argue about the absence of a cost-benefit analysis. So the industry would effort in every exhaustive way to advocate the economic interest. That could be moderated. In some cases, may be upheld by the court, and in other cases, may be reprimanded and corrected by court authority. So you see, for example, in the case titled NAACP et al. Versus Federal Power Commission, the case revealed the social activist group about discriminatory practice employment, race, involving racial minority and others. The organizations titled a Federal Power Commission is the statutory organ which is responsible to control the rate of power prices, electricity and others, and they are empowered of a statutory empowered to regulate the price power. The activist group actually petitioned the Federal Power Commission would issue a rule requiring equal employment opportunity. Hands on a different mouse. You see now in the second case, decided in 1976, and the Federal Power Act, as amended by Natural Gas Act, charges the FTC with responsibility to set just reasonable and reasonable prices for the sale of electricity and natural gas. So, the petitioner in this case is named the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Of course, in joint context of proceeding with several other organizations. So the only terms and concept which would be crucial to dispose this case can be found. Serve the public interest. That is the concept, which is very general and abstract. So, in circumscribing the legitimate scope of a power granted to the Federal Fair Commission should be looked into as centralized on this phrase, serve what is the public interest. So they have the power to regulate the price of electricity power. And also they could employ any measures to serve the public interest. So how do you contextualize the value of equal employment with the scope power now as contended and disputed? The Federal Power Commission could be seen to be empowered with the power to impose some employment restrictions in advocacy of a fair, unequal employment opportunity or non-discrimination. How do you consider? Without necessarily endorsing the specific identification of cause, arguably within the Commission's range of concern, we agree with the basic conclusion of the Court of Appeals on this branch of the case. The Court saw negatively that could not endorse the kind of authority in this case. So the Court concluded that the Federal Power Commission is authorized to consider the consequences of a discriminatory employment practices or the part of its regulatives only insofar as such consequences are directly related to the Commission's establishment just and reasonable rates in the public interest. And the Court also sustained the rule of cause, which rejected the broad argument based upon the statutory criterion of public interest, and the Supreme Court held it was correct in doing so. So you also have a similar context in our point of a contemplation. So very abstract terms that the dyad of two public agencies would entangle with. You see, the Food and Drug Administration, or what we call in abbreviation FDA, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the branches to be discussed in administrable context. So actually, we now know the difficulties in statutory interpretation. They are particularly evident in regulatory cases involving scientific research and conflicting data on the subject under regulation. So let us exemplify one of the jargons which come into myriad of a concern, administrative concern. What is shackling, asbestos, benzene, radiation, and other substances. They have appeared in new reports in association with various diseases. When such research findings appear, environmental groups, health organizations, and members of Congress instruct agencies to take steps to minimize the danger. The problem is actually perplexing, because while data may establish an association, it often cannot distinguish between safe and unsafe levels of exposure. So 1% would suffice, or others. So it would the principal culprit leading to disease, for example. However, what is then adequate public measure to respond with, to counter the harms? So statutes passed during these decades have been characterized as having very broadest goals. Notably, for example, to provide safe and healthful employment. In the concern of NAACP case, alongside very specific but incomplete standards and criteria. A standard which most adequately assures to the extent feasible on the basis of best available evidence. So this is also a popular term that the congressman would like to incorporate, the best available evidence. And also we see many contexts, even in terms of international trade, anti-dumping context of regulation or international norms in that concern, best available evidence. So in the case titled Industrial Union Department versus American Petroleum Institute, we see some intense conflict between public good, allegedly a public good, and the interests of industry. How much extent of safety or health standard should be afforded, and how the businesses could disfavor the kind of action or decision. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 delegates broad authority to the Secretary of Labor to promulgate a standard to ensure safe working conditions for the nation's workers. Section 3 of the Act defines an occupational safety and health standard as a standard that is reasonably necessary or appropriate to provide safe and healthful employment. Where toxic materials or harmful or physical agents are concerned, a standard must also comply with Section 6B.5, which directs the Secretary to set the standard which most adequately assures, to the extent feasible, on the basis of best available evidence, that no employee will suffer material impairment of health or functional capacity. When the toxic material or harmful physical agent is a carcinogen, the Secretary has taken the position that no safe exposure level can be determined, and the Section 6b-5 requires him to set an exposure limit at the lowest technically feasible level that will not impair the validity of the industries involved. So OSHA and the context of industry interest could clash. In this case, there are a scope of a argument to challenge the irrational unreasonableness and also a failure of administrative agencies. For example, industry have failed to prove that there is a safe threshold level of exposure to benzene, which no excess leukemia cases would occur. So it was appealed. So in some cases, they reached some appealing compromise, which could not be supported in any judicial yardstick, for example. And consent settlement in other many cases, we see some soft nature of administrative techniques. How do you consider the judicial intervention in that sphere, province? In this case, 1 ppm or 10 ppm could matter. However, the court see otherwise, and also since the importance could be recourse, could have recourse in terms itself, and actually conditions in linguistic expression would prevail. No mathematical straitjacket could be required to apply a cost-benefit analysis. So the point would rather lie within how to demonstrate a significant risk of harm. If we refer to the rest of history, we can find the Congress was concerned not with absolute safety, but with the elimination of a significant harm. And the industry filed grievances. For example, it is unreasonable to assume the Congress intended to give the Secretary the unprecedented power of American industry that would result from the government's view and coupled with OSHA's a cancer policy. So actually, the requirement is highly imposing and would require much revamp of existing facilities and some high extent of renovation to comply with the rules formulated by OSHA and others. So it would be actually depraving out of a due context of understanding of a statute and basic structure of American society between industry and government structure. And this kind of controversy also resurrect in Chevron case. In that case, the Clean Air Act would come into review, and you see in the act enacted by Congress in 1977, titled the Clean Air Act Amendments, granted the power to shape some countervailing measure against the environmental degradation or pollution and others. In the statute, the congressman employed the word stationary sources. Let us have some more details. It requires states that had not met national air quality standards to establish a permit program regulating new or modified major stationary sources or of air pollution. In 1981, the EPA created regulations on how to implement the permit requirement, allowing a state to adopt a definition of term stationary source. This means that plants with several pollution-emitting devices could modify just one piece of equipment without meeting the permit conditions. So, who will likely file the grievances? Business or environmentalists? So, the action taken by EPA is rather generous and might be arbitrary since the rule could be asserted in any strategic way, impermissibly strategic way. One piece of equipment could suffice the conditions the EPA set forth. If the modification did not increase total emissions from the plant, that could be sustained. It's actually a result-oriented policy. Very good in economic viewpoint. How do you see? Such an interpretation allows the state to treat all the pollution-emitting devices within the same industrial grouping as though they were encased within a single bubble. So the complicacies will be expected, you see, and a specific situation could well variegate the conditions to be proper, so as to be proper. The Natural Resources Defense Council, a national environmental public interest organization, challenged EPA's bubble concept, asserting it was contrary to what Congress envisioned as a stationary source in its amendments to the Clean Air Act. The point would be the statutes are highly probable about less clarity and so regional people in many cases can disagree about their meaning, and the courts could be drawn into an endless debate with agencies about what the statute mean. And we also consider briefly the principal agent theory. However, the time would be up, so I now close this class at this point of time, and for that could be for next class, and then we'll meet on Thursday to deal with the rest of issues and the cases undealt. Okay. Thank you for your attention, and that'll be all for this class.